So one of the questions that came up after posting our pistol episode of Forrest Command was the follow-up question of, actually, how many sabers did Forrest Cavalry have? Or we could even include Western Confederate Cavalry in general. So this week on the 11th OVC, how many sabers did Forrest Cavalry or Western Confederate Cavalry actually have? Now, of course, the reason for this video is kind of an obvious follow-up to the pistol episode, because Forrest Command has a lot of just tradition and legend, and there's so much written about Forrest, and there's a lot of myth and fact about Forrest Command that the view of the traditional Western Confederate cavalry soldier was one of multiple pistols, no sabers. They discarded the sabers on the ground, and they just gallivanted the Western, Tennessee, Mississippi, or just a whole Western theater with a bunch of pistols and no sabers. This week on the 11th OVC, we're going to dive into, was that actually true? So as always, we're going to dive into those primary records, mainly the few ordnance returns that we could actually find for Forrest Cavalry and some interesting memoirs and accounts of Western Confederate cavalrymen. What was interesting about the research for this video is that we were actually using the same returns and ordnance reports that we used for the pistol episode. If you haven't seen the pistol episode, go ahead and click up here and watch that. It's definitely an interesting conversation considering they were known for multiple pistols and no sabers, and we kind of debunked the multiple pistols conversation. What about the sabers? Well, diving into the saber conversation, on May 8th, 1863, Bishop Payne wrote a memorandum to Jefferson Davis actually stating the following. Of 960 men in the 2nd Alabama, only 350 are armed. Bartow's regiment, which is the 2nd Tennessee Cavalry of 540 men with 40 horses, were principally armed with shotguns. Major Ing has 250 armed with shotguns and very few pistols or sabers in the command, except the 2nd Alabama Regiment. Meaning by the 8th of May, 1863, the condition of Ruggles and Chalmers districts during this time frame were in desperate need of every arm possible, including sabers. For example, in this memorandum, it sounds like Northern Mississippi Confederate Cavalry were primarily armed with shotguns only and little to anything else. It must be noted that by the time of the 2nd Alabama Cavalry Regiment and the 56th Alabama Partisan Rangers, including Ing's Regiment of Mississippi Cavalry, Bartow's 2nd Tennessee Cavalry, and Owens' Arkansas Battery were transferred from Ruggles District to Samuel Ragg Ferguson's command on August 27th of 1863. When they did this, of course, they were at better effective strength, but they were also supplied slightly better. So if you take a look at the 22nd Tennessee Cavalry first quarter of 1864, more than likely done in February of 1864, you'll see that the regiment only had 20 sabers. 20 sabers for a regiment that had 200 rifles. So more interestingly, in August of 1863, Chalmers' 2 brigades reported actually 0 sabers in the 1st Brigade and only 21 sabers in the 2nd Brigade. However, what throws a wrench into this entire conversation is that in that same return, it says that 208 cavalry sabers were, quote, ready to be issued to those 2 brigades within short order. Now, that's definitely not enough to outfit all of the soldiers or all the troopers with their own saber, but it drastically increases the percentage of those cavalry troopers with sabers. And again, going into the National Archives, another return from the first quarter of 1864 for the 2nd Missouri Cavalry, they show that they only have 8 sabers in the entire regiment. Again, 8 for a whole regiment. And what I found interesting was that there was far more evidence in letters and other writings sent to Richmond stating that the vast swaths of cavalry regiments were woefully under-equipped, including sabers. You can actually even go further and look at the ORs, or even in Record Group 109 that contains these returns and, of course, Confederate documents in general. And with all of this, it looks like for at least Western Confederate cavalry, the myth or the legend that Confederate cavalry did not carry sabers actually seems to be relatively true. However, the evidence that we just talked about brings up a kind of a tangential question. And that question is, did the Confederate cavalry not carry sabers because they found them tactically and strategically not effective or an inferior arm? Or did they not carry sabers because the supply chains and the logistical capabilities of the Confederate Army were woefully inadequate, possibly even from the very beginning of the war? Which one do you think? And out of those two possibilities, which one do you think was actually more accurate? And of course, I'm sure you guys will comment below saying actually both of those reasons could be true at the same time, but did one actually take more precedence than the other? I'm curious what you guys think. Go ahead and comment below. Now, moving on to what the veterans themselves said about sabers, there's a wide variety of sources, diaries, and letters that talk about their use of sabers during the war, or the lack thereof. However, I must insert a disclaimer in here before we move forward. There are so many rumors surrounding Forrest and his exploits and the legend and the myth that is Nathan Bedford Forrest that it's hard to track down where these original statements came from. For instance, Forrest supposedly said, "Give me a good horse, a good revolver, and a good bowie knife, and I'll whip any number of their sabers." This statement can be found in a handful of modern articles and even books. However, I cannot find the primary source or even the secondary source that indicates who heard it or wrote it or jotted it down when Forrest actually said that. So using that as an example, I have to actually leave out dozens of comments that seem to be more legend than truth. And guys, if you know the primary source, especially of that quote right there, where Forrest actually said, "Give me a pistol, give me a bowie knife, give me a couple pistols, I'll whip any sabers," then please let me know where that is. I'll put it in another video because I could not find the primary source. Now, moving on to the still amazing volume of writings and letters and diaries, and more specifically, post-war accounts of what Western Confederate cavalrymen thought about the saber. Written inside the book, The Campaigns of Lieutenant General Nathan Bedford Forrest and Forrest Cavalry by Thomas Jordan and J.P. Pryor of 1868, the author writes the following. Turning with his squadron upon battery, Forrest charged it, leaving Hanson to engage the infantry. About the battery, a hand-to-hand struggle ensued for a few moments. The Federals stood their ground manfully and fought obstinately. Sabers, pistols, and carbines were lavishly used, with much cost of life and wounds on both sides. Additionally, in another account by that same veteran, he mentions how Forrest's cavalry charged into a mob of angry civilians. But the greedy populace were as deaf to his entreaties and heedless of all mild efforts to clear the warehouse of their presence, and he was compelled to employ force. The order accordingly was given to charge with drawn sabers and expel the intruders, and right effectively was it executed. Again, in another engagement with the enemy, the veteran trooper writes the following. At 20 paces, the Confederates gave a volley with the shotguns, a formidable weapon at short distance, and rushed in with pistols and sabers. In following that, in another article written by a separate veteran in the 1890s, he mentions that, quote, "The privates of the 2nd Georgia Cavalry were fine-looking men and better skilled in the saber exercise than any other of the command." So now with those previous accounts, one would kind of maybe conclude that those soldiers actually had a fair amount of sabers. If they're going in with pistols and sabers, then obviously there's enough to note, not just one or two, but enough that they were using sabers. However, as the war grew on, and actually if you read more of these regimental records, more of these diaries, more of these accounts, especially like those accounts written by veterans in the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s, it becomes clear that as the war progressed, the Confederate cavalrymen kind of either seemed to lose their sabers or they plain just didn't have sabers. However, the contrary to that is even all the way through the end of the war, it seems like the officers, as you might expect, carried their sabers or didn't get rid of their sabers or didn't lose them, whatever you want to say. They had their sabers up until the end of the war. In fact, the account of Rucker's capture by Federals is a great example of this. Colonel White, its commander, was directed from behind the breastworks just leftward of the turnpike, and Rucker then repaired in person further to the left to dispose of the 7th Alabama precisely as he wished. Returning presently to the point he had indicated for the 12th Tennessee, he found himself in the midst of a mounted regiment. Inquiring for the commanding officer, he was immediately approached by an officer so closely that both saw, from their uniforms, that they were enemies. Both drawing their sabers sprang to the conflict with like spirit. The weather was, however, so cold that the combatants could not manage their horses, and Rucker's saber, as he struck with all his power, missing his aim, fell from his hand. With that, in immediate contact with his foe at the moment, he grappled and wrenched his own sword from the Federal officer. In that same memoir, it mentions the dichotomy between Federals and CS cavalry by stating the following. Forrest and his staff were armed each with 2 Navy revolvers and the men with rifles as well as pistols. It was a contest of sabers with firearms in a thick wood with the odds of 4-1 against the Confederates. And in another excerpt from the Confederate Veteran, written by a Western cavalryman who rode under the command of Frank Armstrong, constituting the 2nd Missouri, 2nd Arkansas, and 1st Mississippi, 7th Tennessee, in July of 1862, they were still drilling as a dismounted unit, but he mentioned that they, quote, became quite good with the saber. Also, it mentioned that General Armstrong ordered the bugler to sound the charge, and that, quote, they thundered down a dusty lane by platoons with drawn sabers. He also goes on that same memoir to say that the government issued sabers actually made in Alabama. And he said that, quote, camped near us was an infantry regiment from Alabama which had no arms and was waiting drill till they could be supplied. Our regiment was well mounted and we had mostly good muzzleloading shotguns. But later on in his memoirs, he states, in early October of 1862, the 1st Alabama Regiment, commanded by Colonel Morgan of Selma, Louisiana, was encamped at Laverne, Tennessee. They were armed with double-barreled shotguns and old muskets, some flint and steel, and all kinds of pistols, some of these also being flint and steel. So, now fast forwarding from 1862 to 1864, that same Confederate veteran writes that they were ordered into camp to get bridles and sidearms, meaning pistols. And he actually says, quote, as they carried no sabers in those days. So that same regiment, having conducted 2 saber charges in 1862, was clearly not really carrying sabers in 1864, since he literally said, as we didn't carry sabers, quote, in those days. Again, whether it's a lack of supply or just by choice is a fun study for another video. But regarding this myth or this legend of Nathan Bedford Forrest, or let's just say Western Confederate cavalry in general, not carrying sabers, I would actually have to say that this one is actually pretty true. The sabers listed in the ordnance returns, the letters and the memoirs, and the accounts in the 1890s of veteran soldiers saying as much, I would have to actually say that that's pretty true. So I'm kind of curious what you guys think. So of course, you can't generalize and sweep across all regiments, and always it depends on what unit, what regiment, at what point in the war that we're talking about. But overall, it's pretty clear that Forrest Cavalry Command in 1862, and especially in 1864 at the end of the war, didn't end up with sabers. I mean, just go back in this video a few minutes when I said that that regiment only had 21 sabers for an entire regiment. 21 sabers, which actually, if you do the math, probably supports the idea that only officers carried sabers at that time. Anyway, I'll end the video here. Comment below on what your thoughts are, and if you find a piece of evidence either way, please link it below in the comment section. I loved researching this one because there was so much written about Forrest troopers in the late 1800s and early 1900s that there's a volume and a wealth of information. All right, that's enough for this video, but I'll have to end it here. But I really comment below, guys, on what you guys think. I mean, it was interesting with Forrest Cavalry specifically. There is so much information published and available on Nathan Bedford Forrest because, of course, it being Nathan Bedford Forrest, even Western Confederate Cavalry, that there's a wealth of information. In fact, honestly, I got kind of tired running across memoirs and accounts and regimental histories, basically supporting that those Confederate cavalry troopers definitely didn't carry sabers later on in the war, definitely by 1864. So guys, if you have actually other evidence or other records or returns, please link them below in the comments. We'd love to see them. We might put them in another video. I love primary history, as you know. If you want to go ahead and support us, go on to theresearcharsenal.com, become a subscriber, and join one of the fastest growing Civil War communities out there, especially for the primary research side of things. But guys, appreciate you watching. Like the video, comment below, and of course, until we see you in the field next time, ride hard.